A crisis has scarred Britain for decades, exposed only recently, a crisis that has shattered many lives of children and humiliated institutions. It is not just some ordinary crime, it is a very dark, devastating export from a place far beyond Britain's borders. Today, we are going to uncover the truth behind cultural attitudes that have, with time, become a massive export from Pakistan's heartland to Britain's vulnerable communities that has now been institutionalized and terrorizing many children, many young girls. Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Moon. From the industrial towns of Rotherham to the streets of Rochdale, Telford to Newcastle, organized networks, predominantly of Pakistani origin men, have targeted vulnerable British children. This wasn't opportunistic criminality. It was a logical outcome of deeply embedded cultural attitudes. And the numbers are staggering. Pakistani origin men are up to 4 times more likely to be reported for child sex grooming offences than the general population in England and Wales. We're talking about an estimated 1,400 children abused in Rotherham alone, with victims as young as 11. These aren't isolated incidents. They are a systematic pattern of exploitation that continued for decades while authorities turned a blind eye. Unlike random acts of abuse, these networks operated with sophisticated recruitment strategies, a terrifying economic infrastructure, and even community protection that allowed systematic exploitation to flourish in plain sight. Victims weren't randomly selected, they were systematically targeted based on specific vulnerabilities that a particular cultural conditioning had taught perpetrators to identify and exploit. Working class white girls in care homes from broken families or living in poverty became preferred targets precisely because they occupied the lowest positions in these imported honor hierarchies. But to truly understand this systematic abuse, one has to go back to its origins, to a place called Mirpur. Most British Pakistanis trace their ancestry to this very city. Technically, it is part of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, but more aligned to Pakistan's Punjabi majority. Now, a specific strain of the South Asian patriarchy comes from this very city. It took root in this very city, and when transplanted to British soil, it has proven to be rather toxic. Mirpur represents a cultural ecosystem where Islamic fundamentalism intersects with primitive tribalism and violent misogyny. Within this worldview, women exist as male property, requiring constant supervision and control. The constant of female honor is central to family and community standing, with any perceived transgression potentially resulting in violence, social ostracism, or even death. This creates psychological frameworks where women who fail to conform to strict behavioral codes are viewed not as individuals deserving respect, but as dishonored entities, ripe for exploitation. Traditional Mirpur culture mandates strict segregation for honorable women, limiting their visibility in public spaces. Islamic modesty requirements further reinforce the notion that women bear responsibility for male sexual behavior. And the religious dimensions of this cultural pathology cannot be overlooked. Certain interpretations of Islamic teachings regarding sexual slavery, combined with cultural traditions that consider females who have reached puberty as fully grown women, create theological justifications for exploiting children that Western legal and moral frameworks would clearly classify as abuse. These religious elements add layers of psychological manipulation, allowing abusers to frame exploitation as religiously permissible rather than criminal. But it gets even darker. Pakistani popular culture has fetishized European women, creating a narrative of white woman fantasy that really laid the groundwork for this kind of systematic exploitation. Pakistani literature, cinema, and television productions routinely portray Western and westernized women as sexually promiscuous, morally loose, and eager for relationships with South Asian men. These cultural productions create a chilling psychological conditioning that frames white women as inherently dishonorable and therefore legitimate targets for sexual exploitation. Bollywood and Pakistani entertainment industries have perpetuated stereotypes depicting fair-skinned women as sexually available, while simultaneously promoting South Asian male sexual conquest as aspirational behavior. These cultural messages, consumed by generations of Pakistani men, create expectation frameworks where Western women exist primarily for sexual gratification, rather than as individuals deserving respect and protection. The intersection of religious and cultural conditioning proves particularly toxic. Within Pakistani Islamic interpretations, non-Muslim women occupy lower status positions, making their exploitation less morally problematic than similar treatment of Muslim females. This cultural conditioning manifested directly in grooming gang targeting strategies. Pakistani networks specifically pursued Caucasian non-Muslim girls because they occupy the lowest rungs of these imported honor hierarchies. Victims were dismissed as easy meat or white trash, terminology that chillingly reveals the dehumanizing attitudes enabling systematic exploitation. The specificity of this targeting demonstrates how cultural programming translated directly into criminal behavior patterns. Now let's talk about the perfect storm. The transformation of these cultural attitudes into a criminal enterprise requires certain prerequisites that unfortunately this British society inadvertently provided. Working class white girls in care homes represented ideal victims. Already vulnerable from family breakdown or state intervention, lacking strong support networks, and often dismissed by middle class authorities as inherently problematic rather than children needing protection. Pakistani grooming networks developed sophisticated recruitment strategies that exploited both cultural understanding and criminal opportunity. Initial approaches involved positioning gang members as rescuers, offering friendship, food, gifts, and emotional support that vulnerable children had never received from legitimate sources. These seemingly benevolent interventions created emotional dependencies that could later be exploited for sexual purposes. And there was an economic infrastructure to support the systematic exploitation through networks of legitimate businesses owned by Pakistani community members. Taxi companies provided transportation for victims. Restaurants and hotels offered venues for abuse, while private properties served as locations for trafficking and exploitation. This integration of criminal activity with legitimate business created economic incentives for community complicity while making detection more difficult for authorities. But the most damning aspect is how British institutions designed to protect children facilitated this systematic exploitation. They failed the children of Britain. Social workers who are trained to see these exploitation indicators instead of looking at rape and trafficking called it lifestyle choices by teenagers. Police officers employed derogatory languages against victims rather than looking into the cases, investigating those cases, and booking those perpetrators who have been exploiting children in the UK. Care home staff observed adult men collecting children for overnight absences without intervention. These institutional failures reflected a toxic combination of misguided cultural sensitivity and class-based prejudices against which children deserved protection. Professionals feared being labeled racist if they identified ethnic patterns in grooming cases, creating environments where Pakistani criminals understood they could operate with relative impunity. The silencing of Sarah Champion, a Labour MP who lost her shadow cabinet position after highlighting Pakistani involvement in grooming gangs, demonstrates how political correctness was weaponized to prevent legitimate child protection discussions.
I am very aware that there are children that are vulnerable at the moment, and one very specific form of child abuse is by organised gangs, family groups of predominantly Pakistani men.
Yes.
And my frustration was that unless we deal with that very specific form and look at the identifiers of those men, children are still vulnerable.
The institutional paralysis created perfect operational conditions for grooming gangs. In fact, they knew that it is community relations, vote bank politics that would be prioritized over child welfare, leading to no prosecution despite overwhelming evidence. And what about the community? When confronted with the evidence, the Pakistani community in the UK turned a blind eye. Rather than introspection and reform, community reactions have typically involved defensive deflection, victim blaming, and accusations of racist persecution against those highlighting the cultural dimensions of these crimes. The continued hero worship of figures like Imran Khan within British Pakistani communities illustrates this moral dysfunction. Khan's public statements talking about women's dress and behavior leading to rape is rather disturbing. Take a look at this clip, where he's used derogatory language against now Chief Minister of the Punjab, then political opposition leader Maryam Nawaz Sharif.
मुझे किसी सोशल मीडिया पे किसी ने मुझे तकरीर भेजी, वो मरियम कहीं तकरीर कर रही थी कल। अब उस तकरीर जो मुझे भेजी सोशल मीडिया पे, उसमें उसने इतनी दफा और इस जज्बे से और इस जुनून से मेरा नाम लिया कि मैं उसको ये कहना चाहता हूं, मरियम देखो, थोड़ा ध्यान करो, तुम्हारा खामद ही नाराज ना हो जाए जिस तरह तुम.
But the story doesn't end here. It's not just about the grooming gangs, because that cannot be divorced from the culture within Pakistan. And what's more disturbing is what we're going to show you next, this exclusive report by France 24 and the Associated Press that talk about how there has been systematic sexual exploitation of children in Pakistan's religious places, particularly places of learning, the Madrasas of Pakistan. Recent investigations by France 24 and the Associated Press have exposed the systematic nature of abuse within Pakistan's madrasas, revealing how institutions claiming to provide free religious education to underprivileged children have instead become centers of exploitation and violence. Government data indicates there are at least 17,738 registered madrasas in Pakistan, educating approximately 2.2 million children, predominantly from impoverished backgrounds. But countless more religious schools operate without formal oversight, creating a vast network of institutions with no central authority to regulate their activities or address abuse allegations. This lack of accountability has created perfect conditions for systematic exploitation within what should be sanctuaries of learning and spiritual development. The scale of abuse within these institutions defies comprehension. France 24's investigation revealed testimonies from survivors describing systematic rape and sexual violence perpetrated by the very clerics meant to guide their religious education. The broadcaster documented cases where headmasters and teachers used their positions of absolute authority to lure children into private spaces before subjecting them to horrific sexual assault. These weren't isolated incidents, but patterns of behavior that survivors described as common knowledge among students. The Associated Press investigation in 2017 uncovered numerous cases of sexual abuse within Pakistani madrasas, utilizing police records and extensive interviews with victims, families, clerics, aid workers, and officials. That investigation suggested the actual number of cases might be exponentially higher due to systematic underreporting and enforced silence. The culture of secrecy surrounding these institutions means most abuse never reaches official attention, allowing predatory clerics to continue exploiting children with virtual impunity. The religious context of madrasa abuse adds layers of manipulation unavailable to secular predators. Children from very early ages are taught to revere their teachers as divine authority, making it impossible for them to challenge their abusers. Within these institutions, children become completely dependent on their teachers for basic survival needs: food, shelter, education, and spiritual guidance. This total dependency creates environments where clerics can exploit their positions without fear of resistance or reporting. Students who attempt to speak out face not only physical retaliation but also accusations of blasphemy or religious dishonor that can destroy their family's standing within local communities. Pakistani authorities demonstrate identical institutional failures, evident in Britain, though rooted in different power structures. Religious establishments wield enormous political influence that actively discourages investigation of abuse allegations. The mere suggestion of systematic problems within madrasas can be framed as attacks on Islam itself, creating political cover for institutional inaction. Accusations of blasphemy can effectively silence critics and protect perpetrators, while families seeking justice often face community ostracism rather than support. The country's inadequate forensic infrastructure compounds these institutional failures. With only one forensic laboratory serving the entire nation, evidence processing can take months or years, leading desperate families to withdraw complaints rather than endure prolonged legal proceedings that often yield no meaningful results. Political leadership at the highest levels has normalized attitudes that enable systematic abuse. Former President Pervez Musharraf publicly accused rape victims of fabricating allegations for financial gain, while former Prime Minister Imran Khan blamed rising rape statistics on women's clothing choices and lifestyle decisions.
If a woman is wearing very few clothes, it will have an impact on the men, unless they're robots.
These aren't just fringe positions, they're mainstream views that shape the society in Pakistan, where victim blaming becomes more important than perpetrator accountability. That victims are blamed for what has happened to them. And add to that another very important layer: the economics of exploitation. British investigators discovered that vulnerable children had essentially replaced illegal drugs as preferred commodities for Pakistani criminal networks. Girls could be exploited repeatedly without the logistical challenges associated with drug trafficking, creating reliable income streams with lower detection risks. The systematic integration of legitimate businesses into exploitation networks demonstrates the organized nature of these crimes. And then there's political weaponization of this horrific crisis. The fact that grooming gangs are involved with political parties and influence immigration as also multiculturalism, adding to the complexity in having more effective child protection measures. More importantly, this is being used as a political weapon by both the far right and the mainstream parties. Far right trying to fast track their anti-immigration agenda. Mainstream politics and mainstream parties ignoring this very problem to further their agenda and their politics. The result is often institutional paralysis, where systematic abuse continues while public attention focuses on public conflicts rather than practical prevention measures. Recent social media amplification by international figures like Elon Musk has globalized local child protection failures, creating pressure for action while potentially distorting contexts and priorities.
In Britain, I kid you not, how can this be real? They are releasing convicted pedophiles from prison in order to put people in prison for Facebook posts. There were, and I'm simply stating a fact, there were migrant rape gangs in England that would run around and prey on young girls, gang rape them, and some people found that objectionable, which obviously it should be objectionable.
While this global attention could motivate authorities toward action, in fact, the matter has been raised in British Parliament as well, but it is political narratives that could be prioritized over safeguarding of the victims. More importantly, if there is political will and if the political leadership really wants to speak, then they will have to confront some of the uncomfortable truths. Within Pakistani communities, this demands an honest examination of how honor-based value systems, misogynistic religious interpretations, and Western woman fetishization create psychological conditions making child exploitation seem acceptable or inevitable. Religious and community leaders must challenge cultural attitudes that dehumanize women and girls, particularly those outside immediate community boundaries. Without internal community pressure for change, cultural attitudes enabling exploitation will persist across generations. British institutions require fundamental reforms that balance cultural sensitivity with unwavering commitment to child welfare. The grooming gang crisis represents more than criminal conspiracy, opportunism, and institutional failure. It shows how a cultural pathology can travel continents to enable systematic harm to the vulnerable sections of a society. The journey from Mirpur's honor-obsessed communities to Manchester's exploitation networks demonstrates the deadly consequences when misogynistic cultures encounter vulnerable children and paralyzed institutions. The story that began in Pakistan's conservative heartland and culminated in British courtrooms serves as a chilling warning. Cultural attitudes have consequences. Institutional failures create victims, and silence in the face of systematic abuse makes everyone complicit in its continuation. Breaking this chain of complicity requires courage to speak truth regardless of political calculations and a commitment to child protection that transcends borders and political calculations. Thank you for watching Statecraft.